Okay, so we are back here. Now that we have introduced the basic definitions of metabolism, we are going to jump right into it. Now remember, we were talking about a specific series of chemical reactions called cellular respiration. This particular series of chemical reactions are the chemical reactions that convert glucose into ATP. And the important thing about ATP is our usable energy source. We love glucose and everything, but it's not in a usable form. So always, 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 we have to convert that glucose into ATP. And the series of chemical reactions that convert glucose into ATP is called cellular respiration. Just what I said, right? Okay. Now, C6H12O6, you don't need to worry about this chemical equation, right? But what I do want to point out is, and this should be yields. What I do want to point out is, for every one glucose molecule that goes into these series of chemical reactions called cellular respiration, for every one glucose molecule that comes in, 36 ATP molecules are produced. You should know those numbers. I mean, think about it. That's a fantastic yield. That is an absolutely fantastic yield. For every one glucose, we can produce 36 ATP. That's really great. Okay. These processes, so the chemical reactions involved in cellular respiration, are carried out in small steps. And what that means is that energy can be released as needed. This is not going to be on any quiz or exam, what I'm going to say right now, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway because maybe it'll help understand. But, we can store glucose, we can store fat, we can store a little bit of protein, not much, but we can store a lot of carbs, we can store a lot of fat in our body. We cannot store ATP. We cannot store ATP. Therefore, we have to use ATP as we make it. So it's just beneficial this way, that the chemical reactions that make up this process happen in small steps so we can start and stop as needed. We don't want to make any excess ATP because we can't store it. So we make it, we expend energy to make it, and then we don't want to lose it. We're going to discuss fat and protein metabolism later, but right now we're going to focus on carbs. We're going to focus on how we convert that glucose into ATP. Boom. Here we go. Cellular respiration. That's what we're talking about. Conversion of glucose into the usable energy source, ATP. Even though it's many chemical reactions, we're going to break them down into 3 basic steps. The first set of chemical reactions is something called glycolysis. Boom. The next set of chemical reactions is something called the Krebs cycle. Boom. And the third set of chemical reactions are chemical reactions making up the electron transport chain. It's like a set of dominoes. One has to happen for the next to happen for the next to happen. So they must happen in this order, and each one must occur successfully. We are going to, for each of those 3 steps, try and give you just the basics, where in the cell it happens, and what is produced. Okay. So, glycolysis. This is the first step. This happens in the cytosol, which means it happens inside the cell, but we're not yet in the mitochondria. Let me go back to this picture. So here's the cytosol. In other words, this could be a muscle cell. This whole square could be a muscle cell, or it could be a nerve cell, or it could be a kidney cell. It could be whatever cell. Well, you may remember from another class that you had before, maybe, the part of the cell that is called the powerhouse of the cell that really produces energy, is called the mitochondria. So the next two steps, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, they happen in the mitochondria because that is, in fact, the organelle that makes the energy. But it starts in the cytosol. So glycolysis happens in the cytosol. It does not require oxygen. That's what anaerobic means. A bunch of steps happen. What we're left with is something called pyruvate. That's all you need to know. We start with glucose, some chemical reactions happen, and we produce something called pyruvate. These chemical reactions occur in the cytosol, not in the mitochondria, and they are anaerobic, which means they do not require oxygen. Now, that first process actually gives us 2 ATP. So we bring in 1 glucose molecule, and just for this first step alone, we produce 2 ATP, but that's not enough. So we're going to keep going. Next, we go to step number 2, which is a group of chemical reactions called the Krebs cycle. Now we are inside the mitochondria. Now we need oxygen. So these are, it looks like I can't even read it. Let's try that again. Let me do this, requires. Remember, glycolysis did not require oxygen. That means it can get started, and then as the body works on increasing respiratory rate to bring in more oxygen, to bring it down to the tissues and the cells, now we require oxygen, and we're inside the mitochondria. And that pyruvate that came from glycolysis, now we form mitochondrial enzymes. So at the end, we form mitochondrial enzymes. In particular, we form FAD and NAD, and those are those coenzymes that we talked about. You don't have to know that specific NAD and FAD, just the basics, folks. Step number 2, the Krebs cycle happens in the mitochondria, requires energy. We take the pyruvate that we got from glycolysis and we produce mitochondrial enzymes. Bunch of steps. It is a cycle. That's what it's trying to show you here. It is a cycle. This chemical reaction leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, blah, 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 blah. But all we care about is at the end of all these chemical reactions, we started with pyruvate, and now we end with mitochondrial enzymes. Just think about on your weekly quiz and on the final exam, just think about matching these functions and whether it requires oxygen for each phase and what it produces. The next thing we have is the last series of steps called the electron transport chain. We are again inside the mitochondria. It is also aerobic, same as the Krebs cycle. This is the final step. This is where we produce the boatload of ATP. But because we also had 2 from glycolysis, the total ATP production is 36. Boom. So we take the mitochondrial enzymes from the Krebs cycle, chemical reactions, chemical reactions, chemical reactions, and we produce ATP. Oh my goodness, it's a bunch of chemical steps. There's coenzymes, there's a chemiosmotic gradient. Holy cow. Okay. So if you're wondering, all you have to know is the total yield, 36 ATP. That's the net. For 1 glucose, every 1 glucose that we put through this process, we produce 36 ATP. If you're wondering, glycolysis produced 2, the Krebs cycle actually produced 2, and the electron transport chain produces 34. However, these 2 get used along the way. So our actual net is 36. So the mitochondria, that's where we have this final production. Inside the cell, producing ATP It is a complex chemical process. I've only listed major things. The mitochondria, as I talked about, that's really the powerhouse of the cell. So the 2 out of the 3 steps here are happening in the mitochondria, including the very important last steps where we actually produce those ATP molecules. So imagine the mitochondria as like the little power plant of your cell, constantly taking in glucose, forming ATP, taking in glucose, forming ATP. We know that carbohydrates serve as fuel to our cells. Well, folks, here is how. All these chemical reactions. All right, so if we put it all together, this is what it would look like, right? We bring in the carbs. We digest them mechanically and chemically. Then we absorb our broken down carbohydrates. I'm so sorry, excuse me. Maybe it's just one, is it 2? Again, I apologize. We break down the carbs, we absorb them, and then they go to the liver and then the cells where they are formed into ATP. Of course, some of that glucose is stored for later, but some of it does go to our cells to immediately be produced, to be converted into ATP. I'm so sorry. Remember, and actually here I have it in red, so I'd like you to know it. ATP cannot be stored, so we produce ATP on an as-needed basis. The glucose can be stored. Remind yourself that stored glucose is stored as something called glycogen. You remember this. We store glycogen in the skeletal muscles in the liver. Okay, I'm so sorry. Pardon me. All right, so what are some key points? And I see I have a typo here, carbohydrates. Some key points are that this metabolism process where we convert glucose into ATP, it is the quickest in carbs. But it's not as long-lasting, right? We know that carbs are our immediate, quick energy source, and they're great. But it's not going to give us long-lasting energy. What we're going to see next, this is where we turn to fat. So eventually, we're going to use carbohydrates quickly, and then your body is going to want to begin metabolizing fat for energy because fat can give us much more energy and it will last for longer. Ultimately, you end up burning a carb-fat mixture, but the shorter the duration of energy that's needed, you produce more carbs. The longer energy that's needed, you will metabolize more fat. If we talk about this in terms of not just ATP, but kilocalories of energy, it's just a different unit. ATP is an energy source for the body, but it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. You know, what is 36 ATP? What does that really mean? Well, for every 1 gram of carbohydrate, we know that we can produce 36 ATP, and that's basically the equivalent of 4 kilocalories of energy. So just looking at it as through another unit. For every 1 gram carbohydrate that is metabolized, it yields the equivalent of 4 kilocalories of energy. We're going to see how fat is different from this. Carbohydrates. Every 1 gram of carb, in terms of the units of kilocalories, yields 4 kilocalories of energy. All right, so we talked about carbs. Check. Now we're going to go through and talk about other nutrients. Don't we want to metabolize fats for energy? Yes. Do we metabolize some protein for energy? A little bit. So how do they enter in these processes? We talked about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, there's glycolysis, step 1, Krebs cycle, step 2, and electron transport chain, step 3. At the end of the day, we yield 36 ATP for every 1 glucose coming in. Well, you can already see from this picture, can't you? What we're going to find out is fats and proteins join the party a little bit later. There's some other things that happen. I am simplifying it, but basically, when we metabolize fats for energy, or the small amount of protein that we metabolize for energy, they're going to enter usually after glycolysis. But then the end result is the same. So it's basically the same remaining steps. Fat and protein have their own beginning steps that are needed. In other words, fat and protein have to go through some things to get prepared to go into the Krebs cycle. But once they do, they enter the Krebs cycle just like carbohydrates did. And the rest of the steps happen the same way. All right, so what are some key points about lipid metabolism? We know that the body first turns to glucose or carbs, and it turns to fat next. We know that fat takes longer. So the whole process, digestion, absorption, and metabolism of fats takes longer than carbs. But the benefit of burning fat, metabolizing fat for energy, is that fat provides more energy per gram. So remember, carbohydrates, 1 gram of carbohydrates in the unit of kilocalories of energy, 1 gram of carbohydrates yields 4 kilocalories per gram. Versus fat, 1 gram of fat yields 9 kilocalories of energy per gram. So fat takes longer to get to. It's a more complex process, but our body likes to burn fat because it gives us more kilocalories of energy. It's the same process with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, but in terms of kilocalories, that unit is more beneficial, for example, for our muscles. All right. How does it work? Check it out. The fats, let's go back to blue. Well, the fats enter the Krebs cycle. Just like I said before, there's some beginning steps that fats have to go through, but once they're prepped and ready, the fats just join in the party at the Krebs cycle. Same steps. In the Krebs cycle, it is aerobic. It is happening in the mitochondria. The goal of the Krebs cycle is to convert the pyruvate from glycolysis into mitochondrial enzymes. Those mitochondrial enzymes then enter the electron transport chain. Again, we're in the mitochondria. Again, it requires oxygen. And that's when we produce ATP. So fat goes through the same remaining steps. It's just the beginning steps are different. All right. There is a note here, and I want to point this out. I know that I've mentioned fatty acids, but the specific truth of it is the body can only turn glycerol into energy. Fatty acids can have other benefits, but it's really the glycerol that we turn into energy. Okay. Now, protein. What is there to know about protein? Protein is the last nutrient we burn for energy. We don't want to burn a whole lot of protein. Remember I think I said this in this class. Can't remember which class I told which. Generally, you want only about 10 to 15% of energy to come from protein. This is your goal. And if you're eating a reasonably balanced diet, this will happen. Only 10 to 15% of your total energy will come from protein. And what that means is 85 to 90% of total energy comes from what? Carbs and fats. So we want to burn a little bit of protein for energy, but not too much. How does it work? Well, guess what? Most of these that we do, again, the small amount that we do metabolize for energy, enter the Krebs cycle. Some enter the electron transport chain directly, but I'm trying to simplify it. So we're going to say that fats and protein that we want to metabolize for energy enter the Krebs cycle after they're prepped and ready, and they go through the same remaining steps as carbohydrates did in order to form ATP. Okay, so listen, that was a really, really basic overview, but I just want to wet your whistle a little bit. This is a biology course, which means that we need to be addressing the biology, how it works in the human body. Okay, so we have some odds and ends here to end out this chapter, and they're very important. This first one has to do with, well, how does the body know when to burn carbs, when to burn fat, when to burn protein a little bit? How is this entire process of metabolism regulated? Okay. Okay, I'm just thinking ahead of how I want to talk about this. This is true. I think it's pretty obvious. An active person who's doing more activity will get signals to the brain from the muscles. Hey, we need more energy. So you'll do more metabolism. A person, a couch potato who's more sedentary, they're not going to be working their muscles as much, so the brain is getting less signals from the muscle. Therefore, they don't have to do as much of metabolizing nutrients for energy. But how it really works in our body is, and this is a little bit different, we haven't really talked about this before, but we tend to operate in two states, either an absorptive state or a post-absorptive state. And these states are dictated by the brain and hormones, because those are the things that always regulate things, the brain and the hormones. And what I want to point out is these are dynamic. So throughout different parts of the day, first you're here, and then your body kind of switches to here. 2 hours later, it goes back to here. So we're constantly in flux. And our brain and our hormones are keeping our body metabolically in either a post-absorptive or absorptive state. So what on earth do these mean? Okay, the absorptive state. The absorptive state is happening during and after a meal, which I think makes sense. An absorptive state is indicating that your GI tract is absorbing nutrients. When is your body absorbing nutrients? Right after you eat. So our hormones and our brain tend to get our body into this absorptive state after we eat. When we are in an absorptive state, the rate of anabolism is greater than catabolism. That means we're doing more building. Now, and less breaking down. This can be confusing to people because you think, oh my God, we're talking about absorption of nutrients. Well, didn't we have to break the nutrients down to absorb them? Of course. So there's some breakdown. But I encourage you to think about it from another perspective. The absorptive state, that's when you're absorbing nutrients, and now your body has the supplies to build. Just like building a house or building anything else, you can only do it when you have the supplies and you have the energy. So after we've eaten, we have fuel, carbs, fat. We have structure, amino acids, proteins. So it is after we eat, for a couple hours after we eat, that our body is in this absorptive state where we do more building. There's going to be some breaking down too, there always is. But compared to each other, there will be more building than breaking down. On the other hand, between meals overnight, we're in a post-absorptive state when you haven't eaten recently. And this is where our rate of catabolism is greater than anabolism. Because we haven't brought in nutrients and supplies in a while, we have less building. And where does the catabolism coming from? Breaking down stored nutrients. So because we haven't brought in food recently, your body will start to break down glycogen and stored fat. That's why we get a little bit more rates of catabolism instead of anabolism. There's, of course, much more going on within these, but as a basic introduction, this is really how our body fluctuates. All right. I mentioned that these states, absorptive and post-absorptive, are carried out by hormones in the nervous system. So I mentioned the nervous system, fine, don't worry about it. But I do want to mention some specific hormones related to hunger and metabolism. Insulin and we talked about this in the carbohydrate chapter, so it should be a review. Insulin is a hormone that is released when blood sugar is high, and glucagon is released when blood sugar is low. Let's think about the post-absorptive state. If you haven't eaten for a while, we're going to have more insulin and more glucagon. In the post-absorptive state, you're going to have more glucagon because you're breaking down energy, you're breaking down carbohydrates and stored fat for energy. Versus in the absorptive state, you're going to have greater levels of insulin because you just brought in nutrients, and this is released when nutrients, particularly glucose, is high. So you should just know that insulin is released when blood sugar is high in the absorptive state, and glucagon is released when the blood sugar is low in the post-absorptive state. All right, we're going to power through this. Hope you're ready. You know, it's hard for me to find the right space to fit in diabetes. I mentioned it briefly in the carbohydrates chapter. Well, here it comes up again because we're talking about our ability to metabolize carbohydrates for ATP, which depends on our ability to regulate blood glucose. If we're going to be converting glucose into ATP, we got to make sure we have the right amount of glucose around so that when we need to break down more glucose into ATP, we have glucose available. When we don't need to break down glucose into ATP, then we don't want glucose as much in the bloodstream. Well, an inability to regulate blood glucose properly is a very serious condition. It can be diabetes. Type 1 is typically marked by a lack of that insulin hormone. Type 2, there probably is insulin present, but the body is resistant to it. We're talking about the basics. The effects on the body can be vast. If glucose builds up in the bloodstream, it can lead to heart disease, stroke, plaque buildup, poorer circulation. I think you're pretty familiar with those things. If we don't have as many carbs available to burn or metabolize, we're going to metabolize more fat. You might think, oh, burning fat's a good thing. Well, burning fat in reasonable amounts is a good thing, but diabetics who may not be able to get that sugar into the muscles, they don't have as much sugar to go off of, so their muscles will burn too much fat. If we burn too much fat, there's a byproduct called ketones. Anytime you burn fat, you produce ketones. But here we're talking about an excessive amount of ketones. So if a diabetic, for example, can't get that glucose into their cells, they're going to burn more fat. Burning a little bit more fat is good, but if we burn too much more fat, then it will produce so many of these ketones, which can be acidic. So in excess, ketones make blood acidic, and it can be very serious. Maybe you've heard of a diabetic ketoacidosis situation. Diabetic ketoacidosis. They're a diabetic, ketoacidosis. Their blood has become acidotic or acidic because of too many ketones. Ketones are a byproduct of fat metabolism, okay in small amounts, dangerous in excess. Here are some suggestions for a diabetic because it can be managed, and a lot of that is managing nutrition, which is hard, but very possible. You don't need to know all these. This is just extra. Okay. That's an old picture of me. Whew. I got to change that. Not happy with that one. That's way back 2010, folks. Whew. Let's talk briefly about metabolic rate. We already know that people with a high metabolic rate metabolize nutrients quickly. Maybe you've got a friend, maybe it's you, who can eat whatever they want, never gain weight, probably because they have a high metabolic rate. People with a low metabolic rate tend to metabolize nutrients more slowly. How do we measure? So you should know what I'm putting in red. How do we measure metabolic rate? Well, we have to first define. We can talk about basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate is the energy needed or metabolic rate needed for essential activities. And I'm going to say organ activities. Energy needed for essential organ activities. Basal metabolic rate means this is the amount of energy that you need if you're sitting on the couch all day doing nothing. Not that you would ever do that. My point is, even if you don't do anything, even if you don't walk, you're still burning calories. Your body still needs energy because your organs are working. So this would be basal metabolic rate, the number of calories you burn, the energy needed just to keep your organs going at rest. A simple, quick, and dirty way to estimate what your basal metabolic rate would be, take your weight in pounds and multiply by 10. For example, I fluctuate somewhere around 150. If I take that times 10, that's 1,500 calories. So that means my body needs about 1,500 calories just to keep its body going, its organs going. And then if I exercise, if I take the stairs, if I walk, then I've got to add more calories to my need. I give you an example of how many calories per energy for a male, but you don't need to know that. So let's talk about total metabolic rate. And I'm going to go ahead to this picture. It's simple. It's a good old-fashioned pie chart. Okay. So total metabolic rate. So now let me do this in red. And we're almost done here, folks. Bear with me. Total metabolic rate. Total metabolism. All the chemical reactions in the body. We talked about one component being the basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate. This is the energy needed just to keep your organs going. It's a lot, folks. 50 to 70% of all of your metabolism is geared just towards keeping your organs going. Well, what else do we need energy for? What else do we use chemical reactions for? Digesting food. This one calls it thermic effect of food. Just digesting food. Digesting food takes up about 10% of all of our metabolic activities, metabolic chemical reactions. And then the most variable is physical activity. You cannot change basal metabolism that much. It does change with age. It goes down. It does change a little bit with activity level, but you can't change it largely. You really can't change this very much. But you know what you can change? What you have direct control over is physical activity. So the majority of energy our body produces, the majority of carbohydrates and fat metabolized, that ATP goes towards keeping our major organs going. All right, we're going to end this chapter with a bang. Okay. I threw this into this chapter because I think it's kind of fun, and after that heavy talk about chemical reactions and the Krebs cycle, I think this is kind of fun. So we've been talking all semester about calories. I believe one of the critical thinking questions was, how many calories in a Big Mac? It's not a Big Mac. It doesn't have the special sauce, but it's a burger, right? So a Big Mac, I don't know, 550 calories maybe? just for a Big Mac? Well, now I'm asking you, how do we figure out exactly how many calories is in a food? Something called bomb calorimetry. It's not as cool as that picture. That picture is only cool if it's in the desert and nobody's hurt, but it's kind of cool. All right. So I'd like you to know some of these basics. Here we go. Make sure you can define calorie. For our purposes, we're going to use the terms calorie and kilocalorie interchangeably. Technically, they're a little bit different. Nutritionists, dietitians, people, when talking about nutrition, tend to use one. Scientists in a lab tend to use the other. We're going to use them interchangeably. Make sure you know the specific definition of a calorie. The quantity of heat needed to raise a temperature of 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius. Gram. The quantity of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius. What this is really telling us, so I want you to know the technical definition. But I also want to give you a lay definition, meaning a more kind of layperson, down-to-earth definition. Calories would be amount of heat given off by food. Because heat in the body, heat is also a form of energy. So a calorie is the amount of heat that food gives off and how our body can use that heat for energy. A Big Mac gives off 550 calories worth of heat that we can use for energy. A rice cake may give off 50, right? So the more heat that a food produces once in our body, the higher the caloric value. So know both the specific definition, the technical definition, and the more simplistic definition. What I want to talk about is the bomb calorimeter. That's why I had a picture of the bomb. We actually have one of these here at Hudson Valley Community College, right across from my office in our laboratory. So a bomb calorimeter measures the amount of heat given off by a food. And when I say the amount of heat given off by a food, that's another way of measuring the calories, because calories are a form of heat, which our body can use as energy. I'd like you to have a basic understanding of how this works, because it's pretty cool. So honestly, and this is what companies will use, when McDonald's has to supply the FDA with the number of calories in a Big Mac, they'll hire a lab who puts the Big Mac in this unit, a bomb calorimeter, and they measure the amount of calories. So this is how it works. This is an example of indirect calorimetry. So as it was here earlier, it's indirect. And what happens is you have this box. Our box is probably 18 inches by 18 inches. It sits on the top of a counter. You put the food sample in this sealed chamber. Or maybe I should say sealed vessel. So you put the food sample, this yellow thing is supposed to be the food sample, yellow blob. In the case of a Big Mac, actually, they wouldn't do this for the lettuce and then do it again for the special sauce, do it again for the bun, do it again for the beef. They would probably homogenize it. They'd put it in a blender and homogenize it so they can just put a sample of liquid that contains all the ingredients. So you put this food sample in a sealed vessel, and surrounding that sealed vessel is water. Surrounding that sealed vessel is water, and the whole thing is sealed. It's like space-age steel, baby. Well, space-age, whatever the lighter material is. And then the machine will have a thermometer. It will take the temperature of the water surrounding the food initially. We have a beginning temperature. And then, wait a minute, ignition coils. Ooh, we blow the food up. That's really exciting. We burn the food. As you burn the food, it will release heat. As it releases heat, the temperature in the surrounding water goes up. So we retake the temperature based off of the amount of heat that the water goes up. Let me say that again. The amount of heat the water takes on and the amount in degrees that the thermometer goes up, it plugs that into a formula, spits out a number. So we're measuring the heat coming off the food, but we're doing so indirectly because it's really hard to get everything directly. Water is a much better conductor. So we put a sample of food in this vessel, we heat it up, which heats the water surrounding it. We take a before and after temperature reading, plug that temperature difference into a formula along with the weight of the sample of the food, and it gives us an idea of how many calories, right? High-calorie foods give off more heat. The Big Mac would give off a lot of heat in the bomb calorimeter. Low-calorie foods give off less heat. Remember, heat in our body can be used as energy. We talked about this already. 1 gram of fat, once it's metabolized in our body, or if it's burned in a bomb calorimeter, gives off around 9 kilocalories of energy. Carbohydrates, 1 gram of carbs, gives off about 4 kilocalories. You should know those numbers. Proteins is similar to 4 also. You don't need to know that one. All right. How cool was the bomb calorimeter? Yes, very cool. All righty. Good job, everyone. As always, if you have questions, let me know.